Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing the new Michael Jackson docu-series on Netflix. And sadly, this is everything you would expect from Netflix. A cash grab that simply regurgitates old information. If you believed he was guilty going in, you'll likely feel the same way by the end. And if you thought he was innocent, the documentary does little to challenge that perspective. It interviews jury members, fans, prosecutors, Jackson's attorney, family attorney, which the documentary frames as really untrustworthy. And I felt some of the camera work was shady. Like, you could tell who the documentary wanted you to side with and who the documentary wanted you to look at sideways. With the Michael film approaching $1 billion at the box office, it feels like some of the people who have built careers around scrutinizing and criticizing his legacy are seizing the opportunity to step back into the spotlight. The documentary begins with a disclaimer stating that it will examine the case from both sides, but it heavily favors the prosecution. The docuseries gives significant screen time to a woman named Diane Diamond, who has basically been giving the same interview for years. They essentially give her the mic and let her speak. Like, they could have called this documentary Diane, my version of Michael. I think the most audacious aspect of the docuseries is the decision to feature Martin Bashir, a man whose career was shaped in part by interviews that contributed to the public unraveling of two of the most famous people in the world. I think what really rubbed me the wrong way is how the documentary presents him as a credible source, someone who history will vindicate. Despite the immense impact that the interview had on Michael's life and career, this interview became a turning point, fueling intense public scrutiny and setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the court case that followed. And I think Martin's documentary really just pisses people off because of how ill-intentioned it all felt. In the Netflix docuseries, Bashir actually doubles down, insisting that he was simply following Michael's lead. He was given extraordinary access to one of the most famous people on the planet. And the finished product, this documentary that he comes up with, does not feel like a good faith portrait. It really feels like a setup and a trap. Rather than reflecting the trust Michael placed in him, the documentary leaves you with the impression that he used this access against him. In the docuseries, Martin claims that he didn't know how explosive the interview would be, but he knew damn well sitting in that room that Michael's life was going to be over once this aired. He must have known the impact this would have, not just on Michael, but on his own career. At the time, Martin's interview was almost like a dream interview. Like, he'd built his career off the backs of two of the most famous people on the planet. Like, his name is now permanently attached to Michael Jackson and being responsible for his downfall at the time. And so I do think, you could actually make a whole documentary just about the filming of that documentary, because it is a very important documentary to analyze and revisit, because this documentary is what gave that trial credibility. And there's just nothing credible about that documentary. It wasn't until after the documentary aired that public perception of Michael began to shift dramatically. From this point on, Michael was placed in a position where he effectively had to prove his innocence, and it opened up a floodgate for lawsuits and opportunistic claims in many ways. And it created an environment where anyone looking for a quick payout knew exactly when to come forward right after that interview aired. That interview just annihilated him, and it made him vulnerable to all kinds of attacks. During the trial, Martin declined to answer many of the questions put in front of him. And in the docuseries, he said this was on advice of counsel. But sir, you're a journalist. And the impression you're left with is that Martin is ultimately working to protect his own reputation. And that's how I felt in terms of his decision to appear in this Netflix documentary. Because over the years, this documentary has been reevaluated in a more negative light, and Bashir's role in it remains a point of significant controversy. At the time, Martin was coming fresh off of interviewing Princess Diana, and the fact that he was able to get Michael Jackson, this interview catapulted his career into the stratosphere. But over the years, its legacy has shifted dramatically. What was once seen as a breakthrough moment is now widely regarded in a far more negative light, with his reputation increasingly associated with controversy rather than credibility. And that's what I felt like the docuseries was trying to do, restore Martin's credibility Because if you restore his credibility, then you restore the credibility of that documentary he made. And then suddenly all the allegations made against Michael feel a lot more probable. The documentary that Martin made also ruined the life of the young boy who was filmed with Michael. The Netflix documentary interviews a lot of press who make it very clear that they were going to turn Gavin and Michael and everything associated with Martin's documentary into a bigger story one way or another. Like, everyone was looking for a come up after that. The documentary could have done a far better job of highlighting the gap between the press coverage and the actual evidence presented. Following Martin's interview, there was a clear appetite to strike lightning twice, with much of the media eager to turn anything remotely usable into a story, if not a full-blown trial. And the documentary does acknowledge that much of the case against Michael was shaped by sensationalist media coverage. However, it glosses over several key moments that made the prosecution appear desperate. And too much of the narrative in this Netflix documentary leans on rumor and speculation rather than firmly established facts. The prosecution failed to present the kind of testimony needed on the stand to make its case airtight. At one point, the prosecution's case was going so badly that the judge permitted them to introduce allegations from the past. Yet still, the prosecution failed to make their case stick. And the prosecution's narrative often felt fragile, with clear gaps that were really easy to pick apart. And the desperation is mirrored in some of the people interviewed in this documentary. Like, they were discussing how Michael was feeling ill at one point, and even his illness was a sign of mass manipulation, even though for most of the trial he was very much out in the public, greeting his fans. They tried desperately in the documentary to frame any setbacks on Michael, even though early on in the case, the prosecution had already struggled to credibly support and sustain its witnesses. The only thing the prosecution had going for it is public opinion. If there was a camera in the room, I think they actually would have had to drop the case entirely. Like, I think the fact that cameras were not allowed was the only thing keeping them going and giving them any kind of momentum. And I think the minute the prosecution revolved its case around Martin, I mean, they presented Martin as a key witness. And he didn't answer a single question. And that's how you know it's desperate. And I think Martin Bashir's documentary, like, I will say this about the Netflix series, I'm glad that they did bring in Martin, and I'm glad they revisited this documentary, because it really highlights how opportunistic this entire trial and much of the broader narrative about Michael feels. On one side, his estate works extremely hard to protect his legacy so they can make money off of him, while on the other hand, the media stays relevant by revisiting the story, because again, Michael's about to gross $1 billion. And to be honest, in the end, the only real winner is Martin. Like, I don't think people understand how famous Martin is because of that interview. The documentary does not grill Martin Bashir enough, but you have to remember he managed to gain the trust of two of the most famous people on the planet. So he was a good journalist. Like, how was he able to maintain that trust? What was he saying to them behind the scenes that they were so comfortable around him? Like, the lore around these interviews still has yet to really be unpacked or explained. Again, there's just something so incredibly deceptive about how he presented himself and the final product that came out. There was a complete lack of integrity in the way this man was behaving, as well as a lot of journalists covering this story that really can't be ignored regardless of what you believe. I think regardless of the verdict, the damage had been done. Michael died 4 years after the trial, and he never emotionally, mentally, or physically recovered from it. And to be honest, it's not really until this Michael movie came out that his entire sort of narrative has shifted in Michael Jackson's favor, because the impact that this trial had and the impact of Martin Bashir's documentary, his team was never able to rehabilitate his image in a way that would have saved his career at that stage of his life. Now, the series briefly mentions that one of the families filed a lawsuit similar to the one brought against Michael Jackson, but the documentary doesn't really explore this pattern in a meaningful depth. It treats it like an isolated case. Like, the extent to which multiple claims appear financially motivated is very difficult to ignore. Now, the documentary does acknowledge inconsistencies in the witnesses' testimonies, but then gives way too much screen time to Diane and the prosecutor to explain why those inconsistencies should be dismissed. And what's worse is that the documentary doesn't challenge them in any way or push back. It just lets these explanations go untested. And again, they really gave Diane the mic. One of these standout moments in the documentary is when one of Michael's fans was given access to observe the trial. And she noted how during Wade's testimony, the prosecution was so desperate that they started to suggest that he had been molested while he was asleep. I think the prosecution really failed to create any kind of narrative that the jury found believable. And the jury members interviewed noted how those defending Michael appeared more sincere and credible than some of the former employees and parents whose testimony at times came as though it was driven by personal and financial gain rather than pure conviction. And that pretty much summarizes this entire docuseries. So if you want to be triggered, watch it. But other than that, you can kind of skip it and go see the Michael movie. And until next time.